Well, Steve is certainly a tough act to follow, but every single one of the people on this panel are up to the job. They're all experts in the field of entitlements and entitlement reform. We're very fortunate to have them. We're going to start with Douglas Holtz-Eakin, president of the American Action Forum. He recently served as a commissioner to the Financial Crisis Inquiry Commission. That's the body that tried, sometimes unsuccessfly, to pin down the causes of the crash of 2008 and what could be done to remedy them. It certainly wasn't due to lack of trying on Doug's part that many of the conclusions just weren't there for taxpayers. But he is also a very, very well-versed expert at general federal budget matters, having served on the President's Council of Economic Advisors as the chief economist, and of course as director of the Nonpartisan Congressional Budget Office. Probably, I would say, with the Director of Office and Management and Budget, two of the most important minds in the federal government on issues of taxation and spending. So let us learn a lot from this gentleman, Douglas Holtz-Eakin. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you very much. Appreciate the gracious introduction, and it's impossible to follow Steve here, so I will do my very best. A year ago, the President put out his budget, his plan for the United States, and that budget envisioned a next decade in which we never ran a federal deficit under $600 billion, in which deficits were rising toward the end of those 10 years to $1.3 trillion in 2020, and of that $1.3 trillion deficit, $900 billion would be interest to pay on previous borrowing. And so it was a plan for the U.S. to go into what looked like a slow-moving third world debt spiral. Along that path, in 2015, the United States would fit Moody's Investors Service's technical criteria for downgrade as a sovereign borrower, because we would be devoting over 14% of all revenues to debt service. This is literally a plan and a roadmap to our ruin. It will endanger the foundations of our economic success and leave to our children an economy weaker than the one we inherited. Anyone who works in defense will tell you that the United States' ability to project its values around the globe and thus ensure our freedoms is built on a strong economy, and this would further endanger that. And it certainly wouldn't help that we would borrow large amounts of these dollars from international lenders who don't share our values, and it's very difficult to negotiate with your banker. And so we have a recipe for a threat to our prosperity and our freedom. On Monday, the President will put out this year's version of the budget, and I expect it to be just as disappointing and threatening to America's future. We wrote a piece previewing the budget, all the indications, including the absence of Social Security reforms, their touting of tiny reforms like cutting back on the community service block grant, a huge success by any administration, indicate that this is a non-serious attempt to deal with the problems that threaten us. Multiple commissions, including the President's own Fiscal Reform Commission, have said this is the moment of truth when America has to get serious about all this. And I think this group understands the seriousness, and I'm disappointed that the comparable group sitting in the White House at the moment does not seem to understand that. If you look at those budgets, and they aren't complicated, we're not starved for revenue. Again, last year's budget says in 2020, we're going to raise well over 19% of GDP in tax revenue. That's above historic norms by far. And despite that, we run a deficit of 5.6% of GDP. That's a spending problem, plain and simple. And as Steve articulated, the bulk of the spending is in entitlement programs. And so we have a fundamental need to address the entitlement spending in the federal budget, because literally our most fundamental values about our future are at stake. And it also represents an opportunity for us to do for the next generations the things that were done for us, to provide the kinds of freedoms and opportunity that we have all benefited from. And so entitlement reform should be viewed as a priority and an opportunity, and we ought to get right on it. I think it's also important to recognize that in a very fundamental sense, if you look at the spending side of the budget, we are letting our past crush our future. Entitlement spendings are by and large a legacy to the past. Social Security, Medicare, big dollars are all about the past. And the places where conservatives see an economic role for the government lie in the discretionary part. That's where national security is financed. That's where genuine infrastructure would be financed. That's where the true roles of the federal government are financed. And what we're seeing is the entitlement programs simply crush the ability to finance those opportunities. And that's where growth comes. Basic research, infrastructure, secure borders. We're threatening it in that way as well. And lastly, I mean, everybody in Washington loves to talk about taxes, and I love to talk about tax policy. Anyone who cares about quality tax policy has to understand that if we don't control this entitlement problem, it's not going to matter what we say about tax policy, because we're just going to drive taxes north and crush the private sector in the process. So this is the single most important issue of the moment. And it has to happen now. We do not have the luxury of time. We don't have the luxury of time because of the demography. And the easiest way to explain this is I always use myself as the example. I am 53 years old. I am the trailing edge of the baby boom generation. And so if you do not change my entitlements, you don't change Doug Holtz-Eakin's Medicare, you don't change Doug Holtz-Eakin's Social Security, we will have grandfathered the baby boom, which means we will have grandfathered the problem, and it will be over. And so we have a very short window in which to make the kinds of reforms we need to place in train the reductions in future spending that will actually benefit this economy and bring the budget into balance. So how do you do that? Well, first and foremost, I want to endorse what Stephen Moore said, which is we must repeal Obamacare. We cannot, at this juncture in our nation's existence, set up two new entitlement spending programs that grow at 8% a year as far as the eye can see, faster than any notion of economic growth will be, faster than any notion of revenues will be. This is a recipe for exacerbating our fiscal policies. It is a decisive step in the wrong direction.
So how did they come up with this number?
You let them. You failed us. The Wall Street Journal endorsed it. I don't know why, Steve. No, I mean, you know, the bill is just a it was written to get through the budget process, and it is full of budget gimmicks. It is full of omitted costs. It is full of robbing Peter to pay Paul, but it is not economically sound. And that is, I mean, there's no way around it. It's got to go. Step number two then is to do entitlement reform on Medicare and Medicaid, because not only would that be important budgetary reforms, it would be healthcare reform. Real healthcare reform changes those programs. The fundamental problem with our healthcare programs in the United States is over here, we tell beneficiaries, we tell Americans, you can have all you want of the highest quality, most expensive healthcare in the world, and you don't have to pay for it. It's going to be cheap or free. And over here, we take the providers in the medical community and we say, you give them that, but if it costs a lot, we're going to yell at you. And we're going to cut back on your payments, and we're going to pretend you can get by with less, or we'll start to ration the care. And then when we start doing that, the beneficiaries say, wait a minute, you promised us all we wanted. It's a fundamental conflict that just cannot be solved with the existing programs. First thing we got to do is put them all on a budget. And to establish a flat budgetary exposure for the federal government and Medicaid would be perfect, whether you call it a block grant or not. Here, this is as much as we're going to spend. That's the deal, and then each state can take it and with a lot of flexibility go and meet the needs of the genuine low income that they're trying to serve. And that would establish the old principle that it's no longer being someone else's money. No one makes good decisions with someone else's money. This is the pot of money that you, the state, have. Use it wisely. Be a step in the right direction. Same thing in Medicare. Medicare is bad medicine. Fee-for-service medicine has terrible incentives, and we should be moving away from fee-for-service and toward things that look like Medicare Advantage, toward things that have coordinated care, toward things that allow the private sector to manage costs. We got to ultimately move to something that looks like a premium support voucher model, where we have a defined contribution for quality care. Again, the budgetary exposure is limited, and the people are managing their own dollars, and we'll get something where sensible decisions are made. So these are not rocket science. They are very straightforward. They have never been in the politically feasible list of things in America, but they have to be now. We have to do things differently in the future. than we have in the past, because if we continue down the trajectory politically and economically that we're on, we're courting disaster, and we're courting disaster quickly. So I'm delighted that we're having this session. I'm hopeful that this session and others like it around the country are going to create real movement soon in the Congress and in the White House, because this is the pressing issue of this day. Thank you.